Let me welcome you. Let's get things going. My name is Michael Rosenthal. I'm the Grafstein Professor of Jewish Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and the Anne Tenenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. And I'd like to welcome you to the second of this year's three-part Shier lectures, which will be delivered by Professor Edward Breuer on the topic of Jews and the challenge of modern biblical criticism. The Shoshana Shier Distinguished Visiting Professorship was established in 1994 by the late Milton Shier and his family to honor his late wife of 48 years, Shoshana Rose Lillian Shier. Shoshana Shier was an alumnus of the U of T, graduating with a BA from Woodsworth College in 1973. Since its inception, this professorship has brought such distinguished scholars as James Kugel, Michael Morgan, Samuel Cassow, Rachel Harris, and many others. These scholars have enriched the programming at the Anne Tenenbaum Center and indeed the university by teaching undergraduate and graduate courses and giving this lecture series to the community and university audiences. We're very grateful to the Shier family for their remarkable generosity and ongoing support. Our lecturer, Edward Breuer, a native of Montreal, Canada, studied at Concordia University and then received his MA and doctorate in Jewish intellectual history at Harvard University. After teaching at the University of Pennsylvania and Loyola University, Chicago, he and his family moved to Israel, where he's been teaching at the Hebrew University since 2004. He's written extensively on Moses Mendelssohn, including his book, The Limits of Enlightenment, Jews, Germans, and 18th Century Study of Scripture. And he's also edited a volume of translations of Mendelssohn's Hebrew writings, which, as Professor Willy Gutschel mentioned in his introduction last week, several of us used in our reading group, and which led to kind of wonderful discussions here a couple of years ago. And so thank you for that, among many other things. His current long-term project, a collaboration with Marc Brettler, a biblical scholar at Duke University, is an examination of the Jewish reception of modern critical scholarship on the Bible. 2 weeks ago, we heard the first of Professor Breuer's lecture, a fascinating critical analysis of three common ideas or misconceptions about Spinoza, arguably, that Spinoza's biblical criticism was novel and innovative, that it's a coherent approach to criticism of Scripture, and three, that it was influential in modern Jewish life and thought. It certainly provoked a lively discussion, which got me, and I hope many of you too who are here are privileged to come to the first lecture, interested and exciting about this lecture, the second of his series. And the topic today is cancel culture or Victorian prudence, or why you've never heard of England's outstanding Jewish biblical, and I just can't wait to know who this is, right? It's the mystery. It's wonderful to kind of build in a little bit of excitement and mystery into the title of the lecture. So please join me in welcoming Professor Breuer for the second of the Shier lectures. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for that kind introduction. Thank you to the Center for Jewish Studies. You've been wonderful hosts. I don't know where you all are. Some of you are here and some of you I see. And of course, thank you to the Shier family that made this absolutely possible. Thank you all for showing up. This is a very different talk, as I said. The last one was focused very much on Spinoza. This is now almost a micro history, focusing on Victorian England. If I had put the name of this figure in the title, your eyes would glaze over because no one would recognize him, and that's my point. This way, I think you're curious. I got this wonderful WhatsApp from one of my kids who saw the poster, and I said, "It's so-and-so, right?" And I said, "I'm not telling." Yeah. Okay. There were two great controversies that roiled mid-Victorian England, meaning England of the middle of the 19th century. One of these controversies you certainly heard about. And one of them, I doubt too many of you. Some of you did, but not too many of you. The one that you've heard about, I think you can all guess. A fellow named Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, 1859. There is controversy. The other one, if I throw out the name Bishop John Colenso, I don't think that many of you, some of you may say, "Oh yeah, I've heard that name," but not that many. The other controversy had to do with the historical, literary, critical study of the Hebrew Bible, or of the Bible more broadly. And that makes me curious, of course. This historical memory, historiography, has a funny way of remembering certain things and perhaps forgetting or skipping over other things. What's interesting is that if you look at these two controversies, either judging by the quantity of ink spilled, the level of anxiety, the coverage in the public press, there's no question which of the two controversies is actually the bigger one, really, hands down. I would challenge anyone in 1860, 61, 62, 63 to open up any English journal at the time and not see something about the controversy over the Bible. Darwin, maybe mentioned, but somewhat. As a footnote, I'll have a couple of footnotes tonight. As a footnote, I would say that if you actually look, even working 2 decades out from Darwin's work, meaning 1859, and working outward, you don't actually find the Jews saying very much. What you find is in the Jewish Chronicle, which is the weekly Jewish newspaper I'll have occasion to mention a good number of times this afternoon, what you'll find in the Jewish Chronicle is some mentions. Again, there's no essay or book. No one really relates to Darwin. You'll find a number of editorial pieces, let's call it that, in the Jewish Chronicle that addresses Darwin. And you know what it amounts to? A big shrug. A shrug. And the shrug comes down to 2 things. It comes down to some writers saying, well, this is not settled science. Let's not get too excited about it, or let's not worry too much about it. After all, we'll see. Let's just wait and see. And the other thing that you had some writers say is, look, even if it is true, even if Darwin's absolutely right, you know what? It doesn't matter to us. We don't read the Bible literally. We would easily find a way to accommodate this. So they're not very interested or excited, which, well, let's wait to see what happens with the case of biblical criticism. Now, as I did in my first talk, let me just, again, very simplistically, but very simply point out that when I'm referring to biblical criticism, I'm broadly referring to 2 parallel, complementary, if you will, studies. One is over questions regarding the text of the Hebrew Bible. When exactly did that text, let me formulate this differently. How reliable is the text that sits before us? Might there be errors or other problems that have crept into the text over time? If so, how can we go about identifying these issues? And how can we possibly go back and correct them or amend them? And if it's at all possible, find a way back to some more pristine ur-text. That's what we often refer to as textual or lower criticism. The other, and sometimes really much bigger field in many ways, is a field that really raises, as a scholarly approach that raises questions about the authorship of the Hebrew Bible in toto, and of course, specifically in our interest, you'll see the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. It raises questions regarding authorship, regarding dating, regarding redaction. In other words, when did the various parts of the Bible come together? When might they have been edited, etc. Okay, so why do I say this? Because I need to give a little bit of background here to the study of the Bible in the first half of the 19th century in England in order to give this context. So let me just say very simply, first of all, by the time the controversy hits in the 1860s, biblical criticism is already something like a century old. Okay, so this is not something new in any shape or form. And the truth is, it actually has English beginnings in the sense that Benjamin Kennicott, Robert Loth, Alexander Geddes, some of you may know these names, they were English writers writing in more or less the 18th, some of them late 18th century. But by the late 18th century and through the 19th century, there is no question that biblical criticism is absolutely dominated by Germans. This is true for the textual criticism. This is true for what we call the higher criticism. Again, that area that deals with issues of dating and authorship, etc. So much so that in England, when they refer to this field, they refer to it as German criticism or German rationalism. Those of you who pick up the pejorative or critical sense in that, you hear correctly. So to put this now succinctly, in the first half of the 19th century in England, British scholars were certainly aware of what was going on in Germany in terms of the study of the Bible. But what happened, but England is conservative, small c conservative. They allow themselves to dabble in textual criticism, in lower criticism, but they do not, they resistant, they really are deeply resistant to discussions about authorship, dating, redaction. That does not fly in England in the first half of the 19th century. Just to demonstrate this and to actually put a finger on one of the turning points here, there's a fellow by the name of Samuel Davidson. He is an Irish scholar who is teaching in Manchester, and he is a Congregationalist. I just want to tell you why I'm pointing that out. The Church of England, the Anglican Church of England, is the dominant Protestant church. If you were a Protestant, but not of the Church of England, you were often referred to as a nonconformist or a dissenter. You have to love the way the British really put their finger on exactly what they mean and how they view you. So he was a dissenter. He really he was not part of the Church of England. And you'll see a little bit today why that is and why that is relevant. Early in his career, and Samuel Davidson was actually one of the most serious Bible scholars of England. Early in his career, he defined biblical criticism, and I'll quote here, establishing or sort of fixing the text of Scripture in its integrity and incorruptness, meaning let's return the biblical text if one may. That's what we Bible scholars do. In 1856, however, he published a book called The Text of the Old Testament Considered, and included there a chapter, 40-page chapter, titled Authorship and Date of the Pentateuch, where he presented critical German biblical scholarship with evident appreciation. I'll just give you one line from his book. It is true, writes Davidson, that that tradition has uniformly testified for the Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But if internal evidence do not agree with it, there's good ground for forsaking it. For that, Davidson lost his job. Not because of the Anglicans, but because his own school, a Congregationalist school, said, we will not have this. Hold on to the dates here. That was 1856. The real controversy over the Bible in England starts with the Essays and Reviews, which appears in 1860. So allow me just a couple of minutes here. Essays and Reviews has 7 essays contained in it. All of them, well, 6 of them actually written by churchmen, meaning ordained members of the Anglican Church, 1 non-ordained member, all Anglicans, none of them Bible scholars. But all of them concerned, and this is the whole point of the book, of the Essays and Reviews, all of them concerned to say, hey, to their fellow Brits, their fellow Englishmen, let us take science and biblical criticism seriously. We really need to be more open to this study of the Hebrew Bible. The best known of the group is Benjamin Jowett. He was the Regius Professor of Greek at Oxford, and he writes a piece on the interpretation of Scripture. For those who are interested in the afterlife of Spinoza, he gives a very Spinoza-sounding kind of call that the Bible should be interpreted like other books. I mean, we have to take it seriously, and we only have to interpret it from, the evidence within, etc. There's not, again, these are not Bible scholars. There's not even much specific mention of anything biblical. Roland Williams, another one of the writers, he is one of the few who refers to the late composition of the Pentateuch. But again, his point in his essay is to call for free rational inquiry like the Germans. That's what this is. This is really a book saying, hey, come on, let us take this seriously. This sparks an uproar within the church and beyond. 2 of the members are hauled before what they call the Court of Arches, which is the Anglican ecclesiastical court. They're tried, they're convicted, it goes up to the Privy Council. Brits know how to do things, and then they are the conviction is overturned. They're let free. Okay, but this takes 4 or 5 years till the whole thing plays out. Before I go on to the next round in the controversy, just again, footnote number 2 in this talk. When you look at the Jewish Chronicle, again, the weekly Jewish newspaper, it's only one, I would say newspaper of record, but when you're the only newspaper, I don't know what you call yourself, whatever it was. They, of course, because this controversy played so big, they took note of Essays and Reviews. They took note of what was happening. And they did one of 2 things. Their comments tended to be rather snide on this count. First of all, when the book came out, they sort of said, aha, finally, we have Christian clerics who are willing to read scripture free of church dogma. Wow. And they said things like, this is wonderful. This is about time. Then when the court proceedings against the two of the figures began, they started wagging their fingers and said, this is shameful. This is absolutely shameful. Look at the church. Look at this Church of England. They can't tolerate open discussion. The subtext being, not like us Jews. Just wait, right? Okay. In October 1862 comes the really serious controversy. Bishop John Colenso, the name I mentioned before, who's the Anglican bishop of the British colony of Natal, South Africa, but he is a Brit. He's from England. He's actually he's Cornish, actually. He begins to publish the first of 7 volumes of a book titled The Pentateuch and the Book of Joshua, Critically Examined. Comes out between 1862 and 1879, although the first 4 volumes come out in quick succession between October 1862 and the end of 1863. Now, Colenso sets out in this first volume, because that's the one that sparks the whole controversy, to demonstrate, and I quote, the unhistorical character of very considerable portions of the Mosaic narrative. His intent was to argue that the biblical text must have been written and edited much later than the events they claim to chronicle. His method was to demonstrate the physical and temporal impossibility of those events that were narrated. And the effect, though, and honestly, he misfired somewhat, but the effect, whether he intended it or not, was to make the Pentateuch look unreliable and inauthentic, almost in a way that free thinkers and skeptics did, except this is a bishop of the Church of England. The outcome? He sold thousands and thousands of copies. I mean, when I say 10,000, I forget the number. It's a huge number, way outselling Darwin, by the way. He sold many, many more copies than Darwin. He was threatened by a church tribunal, brought before the tribunal, told that he either needed to recant or give up his position. It went to the Privy Council, and again, it was overturned on jurisdictional basis. What we have again, this is now 1862, just pulling together these few events, you have the Anglican establishment dead set against any of its members who would wander into this area of biblical criticism. And they really did. I mean, again, there were very few voices within the Anglican Church coming to defend Colenso. Everyone was dead set against him. There were a few of the dissenters and nonconformists, and of course, you know, the odd atheists or others in England who were rather joyful at this, but this is sort of the situation. But what's interesting here is that there were also 2 Jews who entered the fray. One of them was Abraham Banish, who is the editor of the Jewish Chronicle. We keep coming back to the Jewish Chronicle, who runs a series of, not weekly, but it was a 14-part series rebutting Bishop John Colenso. It appeared over a year, from late 1862 till about a year later, and then finally he actually published it as a book in 1863. So that's Abraham Banish. Again, it's not an insignificant figure. The other figure who wanders in is Herman Adler, Rabbi Herman Adler, who is the son of the chief rabbi at the time and will become the chief rabbi many decades later. He's young at this time. He's just come back from Prague, and he publishes a letter in the Athenaeum, which is a weekly, serious British publication. And in that letter, he takes on Colenso, and he essentially challenges him and says he's all wrong, and gives a few examples of what that might be. That's December 1862. He also publishes a book. Takes him a couple of years. It's 1865. Now, what's interesting in terms of Banish and Adler, if I, again, just in a minute or two, first of all, they both agree about one thing, and they, and I think other Jews, tend to use arguments like this in trying to attack someone like Bishop John Colenso. They said Bishop John Colenso relied on the authorized version. The authorized version is the updated King James that is used at the time. And he didn't rely on the Hebrew original, meaning he was all wrong. He doesn't know the original text, and therefore he's led to misinterpretations and errors. Where Baynish and Adler disagreed is that Baynish was happy to rely on both the Bible and common sense to try to neuter Colenso's arguments, where Hermann Adler, not altogether surprisingly, tried a different tact and said essentially Colenso was ignorant of rabbinic literature and of medieval parshanut, medieval biblical exegesis, which anticipated and solved all the problems that Colenso is raising. So had he, not been, just pardon my expression, such an amaretz, had he not been someone so unlettered, he wouldn't have written the book that he wrote. Let me just ask the question, which should occur to you, certainly occurred to me. What are two Jews doing in an otherwise very Anglican fight? I mean, it is an Anglican fight. It's all within the church. What does it say about English Jews at the time? Briefly, and I don't think this is particularly sort of difficult to get our heads around. First of all, Baynish did claim that Colenso's book created a sensation among the Jews, meaning that we needed to respond, because Jews too would be wondering. Honestly, I'm a little skeptical. I don't know how many Jews were among those who ran out and bought Colenso's book. A few perhaps did. I just don't know. There's no way of knowing. But there's a broader point to make here, which is that Colenso's book was broadly in the public, in the, when you look even at the popular media, it's perceived as an attack on the value and the worth of the Pentateuch itself, in the first 5 books of Moses, and the Old Testament more broadly. By joining the fray, by Baynish and Adler joining this fray, they were essentially, I think, broadcasting something pretty clear, that the Jews stood shoulder to shoulder with Anglicans and with the Church of England in defense of Scripture. We're with you. Adler's father, Rabbi Nathan Adler, in a letter somewhere to, I think, one of his congregants, wrote something about being a good Jew and loyal Englishman. Just a great line, and it captures all you need to know. And I think their joining the fray was a sense of, well, let's be good Jews and loyal Englishmen. But, and now you can, you're all wondering who this fellow is, right? In the title? Well, hold on, maybe we should stop now. As Baynish and Adler were attacking Colenso, they knew fully well that there was a Jew in their own midst who was rather, well, more along the lines of Colenso's thinking than their own thinking. And that makes things interesting. And that fellow is Marcus Kalish. You see him now up there. It's the only, this and another picture that comes from the same sitting, or the only pictures that we have of him. This is thanks to the Jewish Museum in London, where I was some years ago, and they very nicely allowed me, of course, to copy it and scan it. Who is Marcus Kalish? By the way, in German it's Kalish, but I'm pretty sure in England it was pronounced Kalish, so I can go with either pronunciation. He was born in 1825 in Pomerania. He studied in Berlin. He did his gymnasium, got his degree, very successful. He was a very good student, got all the prizes and etc. So he did his gymnasium in Berlin. He studied at the University of Berlin. Gets an excellent education, not only, of course, in Latin, and Greek and ancient literatures. He wrote his dissertation on an Arabic version of Maimonides' 13 Principles, so he's obviously reading Arabic as well. He's phenomenally well educated. I mean, that's the truth. And when you look at his reach overall, so he gets his PhD in 1847. I think I said that. Then come the upheavals of 1848. Where he's actually rather conservative, so he doesn't really get involved. But when the Prussian authorities imposed their constitution, this is in early 1849, he gets upset and he speaks out against it. And then we don't quite know what happened, but suddenly he leaves Prussia. He makes his way out, so that tells you that he felt that his days there were numbered, and he makes his way to England in May of 1849. 2 weeks in England, he manages to find a job. Who does he find a job with? Chief Rabbi Nathan Adler as a secretary. And it's perfect because, of course, the Adlers, basically the family, certainly senior Rabbi Adler, needed a secretary who could function in German, French, and any other language, and of course, obviously in English as well. As someone who was learned, this was just perfect. So that's it. He starts working for Rabbi Adler as a secretary, and he does some tutoring for Rabbi Adler on the side. He tutors his 5 children. The youngest of those 5 children is Hermann Adler, the same, who will grow up and write those books. And He also has, there's 3 girls and then 2 boys in the family. What I do know is that he taught the young girls French and German. That's what he was hired for. I don't know for certain what he taught Herman, although it is clear that he taught Herman. So this is what he's doing in England. And then he's approached by another family to do some tutoring. They hear good things about him. And that family is the Lionel and Charlotte Rothschild. So he starts tutoring for the Rothschilds as well. The Rothschilds start nudging him to come into their employ full time. He resists initially, but by 1853, it's a done deal. He leaves the Adlers, he goes over to the Rothschilds. He is the live-in house tutor for the Rothschilds, not only Lionel and Charlotte, but Lionel's brother, Anthony, as well, who has 2 daughters. So he's tutoring basically 7 different kids at different stages. Again, Lionel is the one who runs the bank in England. So this is not just simply trivial. It's really fascinating. This is not for now, but Kalish spends a lot of time in their home. That home is, you have Disraeli ambassadors, serious politicians. Everybody is coming through that house. So it's an interesting household. One of the advantages, of course, of working for the Rothschilds is that they could help you with your publishing projects. How do I say this sort of very nicely? And in fact, right away, at some point in 1853, he announces through the Jewish Chronicle and another publication that he's going to be publishing a new work. And in 1855, the first volume comes out. These are actually I'll tell you about this. They're titled Historical and Critical Commentary on the Old Testament. Okay, and he begins with the book of Exodus. So this is now lined up in the order in which they appear. That's obviously not the original binding. Those are, by the way, and he begins with Exodus. It is over 600 pages. It is deeply learned. I mean, it's just, you need to open it, although I have to warn you, this is fragile. The binding is not good and the pages are brittle, so I'm sorry, but we should be careful. It belongs to the University of Toronto. Deeply, deeply learned, making use of Jewish, non-Jewish sources from antiquity up to, the modern era. What he does, and I will quote now a little bit from the introduction, and this really very fairly captures his intent. Of course, my interest here is, what is he doing with biblical criticism? He's, again, unquestionably well-schooled in this field. And when you hear the title Historical and Critical, you say, I get it. But no, listen to what he does. This is, again, from the introduction. The unity of the book of Exodus, writes Kalish, has been questioned not only by that school of biblical critics which dismembers the sacred writings, but even by more moderate interpreters who believe that our book is disfigured by spurious interpolations. We, says Kalish, have in all such passages tried to refute this very questionable opinion. We see the completest harmony in all parts of Exodus. We consider it as a perfect whole, pervaded throughout by one spirit and the same leading ideas, as it is one of the chief objects of this commentary to prove that unity. So he's coming out very strong. He says very clearly in both the preface and introduction that he's interested in a sophisticated commentary. He sort of critiques other works out there. He really wants the real thing. But he's saying that among other goals that he has here is to stand up to these, critics, whether they're the ones that dismember the sacred writings or those that simply claim spurious interpolations. And then he goes on in introduction. He quotes one of the Stehlen, one of the German Bible scholars, who points out contradictions. And he says, well, we've reconciled the apparent contradictions, and talks about the utter groundlessness of their proofs. So you get it. I mean, this is in this sense, again, remember, 1855, it fits very well with what England, where he is in England, which is, again, a very conservative country on this regard. Although I will point out one thing, he is more conservative than even the Brits on one count. He refuses to engage in textual criticism. He defends the Masoretic text. So this is a fully conservative work. He's not interested. Well, he's reviewed in the Jewish Chronicle. He's reviewed in various British theological and literary journals. They all, saying this is nice work. It's good work. It's no question. Of course it is. It's really very impressive. But moving along. 3 years later, now he begins with Exodus. I don't want to, there's a reason why he originally chose, but by the time he publishes Exodus, he says, yeah, Genesis is on the way. So I'm just working on that. And in fact, the next volume is Genesis, which appears in 1858, 3 years later. Genesis comes with a 50-page introduction on basically focusing on scripture and science. This is 1858, it's a year before Darwin. But again, no one should be surprised that Darwin doesn't come out of nowhere. There's much attention being given in England at the time to this problem of, well, the sciences are developing and they raise questions about scripture. So he addresses it. It's very interesting, but that is not our interest for now. And he does not touch in this introduction on any question regarding the Bible, biblical criticism. Of course, it's about the Bible, but nothing on biblical criticism. So what do you assume? What do I assume when I first pick this up? Well, it's just like Exodus, right? Same attitude, same strategy. And then you actually open the Bible. And then you discover something a little different. I'm going to use what I think is the best example, if you don't mind, which is, well, it was read in synagogue a few weeks ago, the story of the flood, Parshat Noach, the story of Noah, where what Kalish does is say, look, there is a problem between chapter 6 and chapter 7. In chapter 6 of Genesis, Noah is told to bring 2 of each animal, famously. In chapter 7, it is 7. So the question is what you do. Well, fine. Well, there's certainly a lot of literature on this, old rabbinic arguments, medieval Jewish exegesis. He considers them and dismisses. And even, a kind of argument that Davidson himself would say, well, I mean, the 7th chapter is simply just a more detailed exposition. But Kalish will have none of it. And I will quote here his line where he absolutely dismisses all of this. He says, the Bible cannot be abused to defy common sense, to foster sophistry and perverse reasoning, to cloud the intellect, or to poison the heart with the rank weeds of insincerity. It's a powerful line. It's a great line. I'm saying if I could do this with a German-inflected Victorian accent, I'd be very happy. But no one has coached me on how to do that. So if one of you wants to volunteer and teach me, I will be very happy. What does Kalish have to say? How does he reconcile this? And I will quote to you now a couple of pages, skipping a little. Says Kalish, the author of the Pentateuch, or the Jehovist, used, among other materials, especially an old and venerable document, that of the Elohist. But again, notice this, the author of the Pentateuch is the Jehovist. But he enlarged it wherever he believed that the context required an amplification. Now, the beginning of the 7th chapter is such a supplementary edition of the Jehovist. In the time of the earlier Elohist, meaning the earlier strata, if you will, of the Bible, the system of sacrifices was not yet developed. The difference between clean and unclean animals was not yet established. The Elohist was therefore satisfied with one pair of every species. His only end was the preservation of the animal kingdom. But the Jehovah's deemed a thank offering after the flood indispensable. This, I'm skipping a little, is the only rational solution possible. But we add distinctly that our narrative is in no other point contradictory. It contains repetitions, but no further discrepancy. The Jehovah's designed full harmony with the Elohist. This is important to him. It's different. It's a different strata, but it's meant to somehow stand in harmony. Then I skip again to give you something of the broader view of what he's trying to do. Scriptures, he writes, do not intend to give mere history. They desire to make the facts subservient to ideas, to teach a general rule, and thus to spiritualize the facts. And this task is frequently performed by the Jehovist. He treats the events as a base for a spiritual edifice. And this is the advance within which the Pentateuch shows within its own pages. This is, again, very important to him. It is no dead letter. It admits of a more and more spiritual acceptation. So here, and another half a dozen places, Kalish essentially has adopted the German, again, we're talking about middle of the 19th century. So it is the theory, the regnant theory at the time, which is the theory of complements. We, of course, would refer to this nowadays as a supplementary hypothesis. So it was first suggested by Heinrich Ewald, Bleek, and others in the 1830s, 1840s. This is what the Germans were doing. And again, very simply, it's that there is a foundational text, which they're referring to as, we would call it E, which was then completed or supplemented by the author of the Pentateuch. Again, we would refer to that as possibly as J. This is 1858, so 2 years before Essays and Reviews and before England as a whole has had that Anglican controversy. Well, it's reviewed in 12 British journals, weeklies, monthlies, quarterlies, serious journals. Some of them only speak about his introduction, essentially, the question and the issue of science and scripture. And anyone who's published knows that there's a problem. Sometimes the reviewers only read the introduction, right? It's a problem. Anyhow, that seems to be what happened in this case, but okay, fair enough. But others definitely noted his, and I quote, his German rationalism. Well, it's not hard to see. And again, I quote, it equals anything we have seen in German productions. This is like, he's gone all the way. But this is important. In these reviews, there's no attack on Kalish. And that is because he's not a member of the Anglican Church or of whatever church they're writing from. He's someone else's problem. Now, those were the reviews in the British journals. Well, is he reviewed among the Jews? And the answer is yes. There's 2 reviews, one in the Jewish Chronicle, and the second one in a failed attempt at a Hebrew monthly called the Hebrew Review. The reviewer happens to be the same person. I'm not quite sure why they did that, but I'm going to now answer my own question. I'm not sure why they did that, except that perhaps there was no one else who could qualify it. And the fellow was Leopold Dukas, name some of you might know. He's actually an important and impressive person in the 19th century. He begins life in the yeshiva of the Chatam Sofer of Rabbi Moses Sofer in Pressburg in Bratislava. So he comes from very good, a Jewish textual background. But then later he becomes something of a serious scholar and works with the same Heinrich Ewald that I mentioned before, who's really one of the leading German Bible scholars. He doesn't work with Ewald on the biblical stuff, but Ewald is also interested in publishing editions of medieval Hebrew grammars. So he joins him on that, which is important because he at least knows, it's obvious that even though he's not working with Ewald on the biblical critical stuff, but he is certainly knows who he's dealing with, and he certainly knows what Ewald is doing in his day job, rather than in some of his side projects. So Dukas reviews Kalish's commentary on Genesis. He praises Kalish for resisting textual emendations. This is what he does. He talks at length about various aspects of what Kalish does with the book of Genesis and says absolutely nothing about his writing on the Jehovahist and the Elohist, etc. He just does not touch it. They were friends, by the way. I should point that out too, but he doesn't touch it. Then comes, of course, 1860, the controversy over Essays and Reviews, but more importantly comes the huge controversy, the Colenso affair, essentially. Now, here's where I have to use my time well. Kalish, we will see absolutely, and you'll see this in a minute, comes out publicly in favor of Colenso. Okay, so this cat will be out of the bag soon enough. But what's interesting is that from a letter in the Rothschild archive from August 1862, we learn, and this is by the correspondence with among the Rothschilds, not with Kalish, but it's Charlotte writing to her children saying, oh, by the way, Kalish dropped by yesterday and has told us, we're very pleased, that he's now going to be reviewing for The Spectator. Lovely. This is August 1862. Colenso's book comes out in October 1862. Within 1 week, there is a review in the Spectator, unsigned. I'll just tell you all the reviews are unsigned, so there's nothing more that we could attribute to that. And it is a remarkable review because it is unlike the vast majority of reviews on Colenso. Again, the vast majority of people who took issue with Colenso were taking issue with him as a member of the church on theological grounds, on grounds of authority, whatever it may be, or on the basis of the very criticism, the kind of criticism, biblical criticism that Colenso uses. But there's no objection to criticism per se in this piece. There's no Christian interest, nothing. In fact, whoever this reviewer is, and you'll catch my hints, I'm pretty sure this is Kalish. I can't prove it, but everything points to it being him, is he says, well, I think Colenso's missed the point, because the point isn't just focusing on the unhistorical character or quality of the work, but rather the real point is to understand the Pentateuch as sort of part of this grand history of the unfolding of the Israelite nation, meaning you have to understand it as part of some broader picture. So as I said, I'm pretty sure that this is Kalish, but it's unsigned and we have to leave it for what it is. You remember I also mentioned before that Hermann Adler wrote in the Athenaeum against Colenso. This is not a small deal. This is the son of the chief rabbi. A week after Adler's letter appears, there is a letter signed by a pseudonym called Philobiblicus, who defends Colenso and pushes back on the kinds of corrections that Adler has made. Well, what can I tell you? Some of the points that are made here were made earlier in Kalish's writings. Some will be made in the future in other writings. Again, I cannot prove it. I want to be very straight with you on that. But I think that too is Kalish's hand. But now cutting to the chase. In December of 1862, again, just very few weeks have passed here, Kalish writes to Colenso saying, good for you. At which point Colenso writes back saying, oh my God, thank you. Can I use your letter? Do I have permission to use your letter in support? At which point Kalish writes back a second letter saying, of course you may. And I'll just read you one line from the second letter. In the meantime, accept my cordial wishes for your triumph in the struggle which you have so nobly undertaken. Okay? Now, how do we know of these letters? Well, poor Colenso, who at this point has, the world coming down on him, wants to defend himself. So in February of 1863, he writes a letter to the Athenaeum, including sort of using 4 letters, 3 scholars who will support him. Hupfeld, who's a very important German scholar, Ewald, same Ewald I've mentioned before, and the 2 letters from Kalish. This is what Colenso has to sort of show for himself in his defense. 2 great Bible scholars. He can't find anyone else in England except this Jew. How convenient. Okay, so this is what appears in the Athenaeum. I think Kalish must have been thrilled, because to be put in the company of Hupfeld and Ewald, it's pretty impressive. The truth is he belongs there. He really does. Well, what does the Jewish Chronicle do? Because, when a Jew appears in the pages of the Athenaeum, even though it wasn't necessarily a Jew writing, they're thrilled, right? So they reproduce exactly Colenso's letter, all of it, Hupfeld, Ewald, 2 letters of Kalish, in the pages of the Jewish Chronicle. Ewald, they attack because Ewald said something about the triumph of Christianity, to which the Jewish Chronicle says, hold on, and they say absolutely nothing about Kalish. They just remain mum, but they're publishing it. So obviously in other words, not every Jew read the Athenaeum. I'm sure not every Jew read the Jewish Chronicle, but enough Jews read the Jewish Chronicle to say, folks, this is what's happening, but no comment. Okay, let's just keep. Then comes April 1867 and the first part of Leviticus. You could see how thick these volumes are. Part 1 of Leviticus is 708 pages, and that only covers Leviticus chapters 1 through chapters 10. I guess even worse than that. And there's a 469-page introduction. Exactly. That is one of the problems here. This man, of course, one of the reviewers said the obvious. Why don't you just publish that as a separate book? Excuse me. Okay, this is what he wanted. He speaks in the preface of an intellectual revolution. He mentions Darwin, Huxley, John Stuart Mill, Renan, the Frenchman, and of course he mentions Essays in Review, Colenso. He's saying, look, there's been water under the bridge. By the way, with Colenso, he says, whose demonstrations were unsettling, in many cases uprooting long-cherished opinions. Now, let me use Colenso's own words to talk about what he actually does in Leviticus. And I think it'll speak for itself rather quickly. The question then arises, writes Kalish, did Moses lay down any distinct laws with regard to religious worship? And if so, are the precepts embodied in the three middle books of the Pentateuch, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, are they traceable to his authority, meaning the authority of Moses? It is difficult to reply categorically to the first point, but history gives an unequivocal denial to the second. History proves, for many centuries after Moses, the Levitical ordinances were neither practiced nor known, that primitive notions and institutions prevailed for protracted periods, that a long and severe struggle was fought between monotheism and pagan idolatry. I skip a little. The Levitical system of sacrifices, he writes, is not the work of one generation, but the result of succeeding ages. Its progress and development were slow and gradual. It was rooted in the life of the people and was the sum of the national experience. These are all really important points, actually. It gathered in one focus the scattered ideas and customs that had imperceptibly spread, but again, spread over a very long time. This is the inevitable conclusion to be drawn from the discrepancies pointed out between the Pentateuch and the historical books, meaning the prophetic books. But that conclusion derives additional force from the fluctuations discoverable in the Pentateuch itself. From all these premises, we are irresistibly forced to the conclusion that the minute and complicated sacrificial legislation of Leviticus originated at a considerably later time than that of Deuteronomy. And as the book of Deuteronomy can, from internal evidence, not have been written earlier than the 7th century, ergo, clearly Leviticus is later. Now, for those of you who know something about the modern critical study of the Hebrew Bible, know that this is crucial. The relationship of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that's a central issue. And the late dating of Leviticus is, again, something that all the Bible critics end up agreeing on, or almost all, till you get to, someone like Yechezkel Kaufman, but that's a different story. So this is Kalish now in Leviticus. It's very, very clear. The reaction, the fallout, again, in the British journals, most noted Kalish's progression from, one of them puts it, the standard of orthodoxy, right? That was his first book on Exodus, to views that marched firmly in Colenso's path. Again, this is just obvious. They're just stating the obvious. And what about the Jews? So again, this is priceless. I could not have made this up. The Jewish Chronicle, God bless them, decides that they're not going to review the book. They're just going to have a notice. And it's sort of a column long, or most of a column. So they have a notice. And let me read it to you, or parts of it. We do not intend to do more than notice this volume. Not that it does not deserve an ample review, but that we cannot spare either space or time. And if we could, there would be scarcely many of our readers that would care to pursue a thorough criticism, ... meaning, effectively, let me just shorten this by saying, look, this is a popular journal. This is not the place, and our readers really can't handle it. But listen now, and then what he does in the middle is actually quote Kalish quoting Spinoza, where Spinoza has a line that basically says, it's from the Tractatus, who says, those who are not accustomed to think rationally, I don't suggest that I don't recommend my book. In other words, if you can't handle it, don't read it. So Kalish says that. Of course, they're using that now to say, okay, fine. We get it. Let me read you the last paragraph here. It's just precious. Although there is much in this volume that we approve, and more that we admire, there is yet much more of its contents from which we dissent, and some few which we would have wished had remained unwritten. It's perfect. I mean, it's really... We commend the volume to all those who are sufficiently prepared to appreciate and examine such grave matters. We can promise them that they will derive from the study thereof much information and learn to regard the Bible from new albeit not always acceptable, points of view. This is really a remarkable notice. It conveys respect, censure, ambivalence. I mean, all this without, this is what's so brilliant about it, saying one substantive word about the volume itself, which is avoided. So that notice comes, and indeed, they don't touch it. Now, to just show you, or to not to punctuate, if you will, the silence, there is another book. The book appeared in April. This notice came out in September, which, by the way, says something too, because usually notices and reviews come very, very quickly in England at the time. They wait 5 months and they decide to do this. There's another fellow by the name of Chaim Gedalia. He is married to the niece of Moses Montefiore. He is, I'm going to say this in one word, a crackpot and a crank. Just that kind of individual who's always writing letters to the editor, always mucking it up. And he writes a he publishes, it's a self-published piece, a 47-page pamphlet. Again, I'll just read to you a few sentences from the introductory paragraph. It is a perfect marvel to me, writes Chaim Gedalia, that so bold a treatise as Dr. Kalish's, and he actually refers to specifically a long 50-page essay on theology in the introduction to Leviticus. So it's a marvel to me that a treatise such as Dr. Kalish's should not as yet have been attacked by one of his own co-religionists or by someone else. It is impossible to arrive at any other conclusion after perusal, except that this book is of a more dangerous tendency than any of the works of Spinoza, Colenso, and others. Chaim Gedalia is saying, hello, would someone please, please, please deal with this? He knows he's not qualified. And indeed, you look at the other 47 pages of this, he is not qualified. He really isn't. But there is silence. The only other thing I want to just add, because I was asked this and I thought it was a very intelligent question. Kalish lives in the Jewish community. He lives in London, spends a lot of time in the Rothschild house, but he's basically living in London. It's not a huge community. You know, there are bar mitzvahs and weddings of the Rothschilds and others where people rub shoulders. And there's no question about that. There's even one better. Among, I think this is from the University of Southampton, where they have the Anglo-Jewish archives, we do actually have a few letters of Kalish to Herman Adler. One of them is a letter thanking Herman Adler for attending the Shiva. He was sitting Shiva, Kalish was sitting Shiva for his father. Herman Adler comes to pay a Shiva call. These people are seeing each other. They're seeing each other in very normal kinds of situations. You come, someone has died, you come and you comfort the mourner, as is the tradition. There's actually something else that happens too, and I found this in the same cache of letters. Kalish actually sends a copy of volume 2 of Leviticus to Herman Adler as a gift. Hey, you publish, you send it to him. So he does it. The letter that accompanies it is precious. Why should I hesitate to send you the new volume of my commentary, which has just been published? People are not divided by a point of view if they know that they are in agreement in their feelings and actions. Conscientious, selfless performance of duty, according to one's best convictions, necessarily arouses sympathy and esteem, which cannot be weakened or shaken by any difference in the interpretation of historical or religious problems. That's what binds us should be more important than what separates us. In this spirit, I ask you to accept the book. Perhaps you will find in it here and there a fact that seems important to you or an argument that seems worthy of consideration. Interesting, right? Really interesting. He obviously assumes that Adler is going to have some objection here, but also assumes that somehow we could, overcome whatever it is. But again, publicly, by the way, Herman Adler never addresses these books, nor his father. Well, so the silence continues, the public silence. Leviticus part 2. 5 years go by, he publishes part 2. Again, very much the same of what we saw just now. But I want to say, because of the mitzvot, of the commandments that appear in that second part of Leviticus, you have to realize the upshot, if you will, of some of his conclusions. For example, the Day of Atonement, not an insignificant Jewish holiday, or Sukkot, the the fall festival. What happens, because of the way he's dated the book of Leviticus, is that he essentially argues that the Day of Atonement, for example, was not celebrated during the First Temple period. It's something that comes later. He actually dates it to the year 440 BCE. Now, he's saying there are certain holidays, certain observances that developed much later in time. This is just the internal logic of what Kalish is doing. So in other words, you read this, it's not like this is all just theory, or, you could say, wow, it doesn't really matter. Well, seemingly it might matter for those who would rather see those holidays as something commanded from Sinai and original to whatever, to that Pentateuch, to an original imagination of what that Pentateuch was. Overall, what he does is he stresses the development of Israelite religion. You hear this over and over again in his kind of writing, that you see the Bible sort of progressing from a focus on the physical and natural world through sort of historical narratives and ultimately ending up with a spiritual view of whatever the Israelites we're going. In other words, there's a process of spiritual refinement. I'll read to you just from the end of Leviticus part 2, which again very much captures what Kalish is doing here. Unless the older portions of Exodus, the enactments of Deuteronomy, and those of the middle books, Leviticus and Numbers, be viewed as so many successive stages of legislation, the grand spiritual and political history of the ancient Hebrews can neither be comprehended nor adequately appreciated. Meaning, not taking this historical view is giving up something very significant, is the argument that he makes. And I'll read you the last paragraph, so sort of the epilogue. In abandoning the traditional conceptions of the origin of the Pentateuch, we gain a great and most valuable boon. For in viewing the marvelous religious edifice of the Hebrews as their own and patiently achieved creation, their intellectual life and struggles are brought home to our understandings and our human sympathies, and thus cannot fail to inspire us with a new interest and a higher admiration. And this is how he signs off. Again, reactions. So the British Review's perfectly clear on what's happened here. He's joined the ranks of the German critics. Three of the reviews actually review him with part 6 of Colenso. After all, they belong together. Reasonable. And then the Jewish Chronicle decides to change tactics. And what follows now is a 12-part review in the Jewish Chronicle, taking on Kalish's commentary on Leviticus. It is unsigned, but other reviews are unsigned too. Of course, I checked that quickly. And I must tell you, for a decade, it made me crazy that I could not figure out who wrote it, because I'm dying of curiosity. Who is going to cover? Who is even qualified enough? And by the way, the Chronicle, before they ran this series, said, our reviewer is, I forget what words they use, is as eminent and as qualified as the author of the books being reviewed. It's nice, right? I was sure it was Banish or Herman Adler, right? It just fits the story. I looked, and Herman Adler's papers exist both in England and the Jewish Theological Seminary of New York. No luck. And then I discovered I was barking up the wrong tree. I actually found out that the author is none other than Michael Friedlander, who was the principal of Jews College at the time. Some of you might know he is the translator, the English translator of the Guide of the Perplexed. So people who own that earlier edition, he's a good, really an excellent scholar. So he reviews Kalish, and this is a remarkable, the 12-part review. We know most of us die for one review, right? Just like the 12 parts. It is hard-hitting, occasionally snide, but overall, this is an even-keeled review, very much of the tone of let reasonable people decide for themselves. He critiques Kalish's, what he views as arbitrary assumptions, internal inconsistencies, that Kalish is too quick to dismiss traditional solutions. And then he takes it on bit by bit and shows how Kalish fails. But note what is absent here. And it's, again, really noteworthy. There's no attack on Kalish himself. There's no engagement of theological issues, inspiration, revelation. No. Nothing sort of even remotely close to, oh, this may offend our orthodox beliefs. It is, in other words, a very technical review saying you argue X about the following passages, and I'm telling you that that's not the only reading, and I'm telling you that it's wrong and other things that you presuppose. And then that's it. Now, in the interest of time, Kalish never completes the series. He falls ill. He doesn't have a lot of energy. He publishes a few small studies, one on the story of Bilam in the book of Numbers, the other on the book of Jonah. Again, very much still in the critical mold. It is reviewed. Now there's another Jewish weekly called The Jewish World. It's reviewed there in the Jewish Chronicle, who, they don't show any particular hostility. They just basically say that Kalish may have done well, far better, had he dropped his critical insights. His arguments would have been more compelling, more acceptable, is of the sort. And then he publishes another book, which is of interest, I think, maybe to philosophers and others, but not for us here. Kalish dies in 1885. There's a long obituary. And it's interesting, of course, once you're dead, the things that could be said about you. So the obituary points out, yeah, his work was actually commensurate with Graf and Julius Wellhausen, okay, which I will just get back to in a moment. But interestingly enough, the obituary gives no sense of how exceptional Kalish was, nor, of course, does it really acknowledge that, something just happened here, which is to say that Kalish went through, published all this book, and that one way or another, the leaders of the community and the sort of the intellectual elite in the community essentially decided to either ignore it or write the kind of review that and this is really important, that kind of technical review ensures that there won't be any controversy. It does not arouse controversy. In fact, it seems ultimately designed to avoid controversy, to tamp it down. And again, they were so successful, they were more successful than they even realized. So much so that, well, you have this obituary, and then you have in the Jewish Chronicle something called the Notes of the Week, which was sort of like these editorial notes, which point out, oh, well, Kalish was one of the most learned Jews, of the era. It's, absolutely true. And you could see that these Notes of the Week were bothered. Why was Kalish ignored? So they say various things, and I think which have truth to them, either because of the quote unquote advanced nature of his views. It was really out of sync where our community was, the perceived deism or rationalism, which again, one can argue fairly, that in his illness, he was rather marginalized. The second of the reviews, interestingly, meaning these Notes of the Week, that appeared in the Jewish Chronicle, actually voiced an objection or a complaint, if you will, that Kalish actually was denied credit for his role in advancing the schools of biblical criticism. He actually wasn't right, but it's interesting that at this point, they sort of say, what did we do here? Now, and I will sign off with this. In the end, I cannot really explain why at least modern, historians of modern Anglo-Jewry totally miss Kalish, and they really do. I think there's something remarkable here, just in terms of a Jew who was really phenomenally learned. It's quite obvious, again, just to state what one of the things I've really tried to do here. So those of you who know English history know that there is much later, in fact, a century later, something called the Jacobs Affair, when Louis Jacobs, and any Brit of a certain age knows the Jacobs Affair, and it really was a major affair. But there was no Kalish affair. And that's the point here. They really successfully ensured that there would be no public issue here. Why? Well, that's not so clear, because as I've looked through the archival and other evidence that I have, there's no evidence of collusion, meaning I don't know of the chief rabbi and his son and other rabbis and Danish and other writers getting together and saying, what are we going to do? They might have. They really might have. I don't know. But one way or another, they were all on the same page. And they were clearly invested in just saying, much better. Nothing is to be gained by controversy. Nothing. So let us simply be quiet. Look, Kalish had no official position, right? He wasn't a rabbi or something that they may have reacted differently. The truth is these books, these tomes are incredibly learned. And the vast majority of Jews honestly wouldn't, even if they read it, I don't know how much they would get out of it. I think they banked on that too. And let's also remember that they had once, and hopefully still, looked askance at the formal prosecution of heretics in the church. And since they spoke out about that, it certainly would be hypocritical for them to then turn around, although that doesn't stop anyone, right? Let's just be very honest. And let me just make one final note, because of what was raised in the one of the last things I said about the Jewish Chronicle, noting what was Kalish's place in the history of biblical criticism. Well, again, I said before, I started by saying this is very much a German endeavor, and Kalish had two strikes against him, and the Germans would not ever have taken him very seriously. He's a Brit, and believe me, the Germans were convinced that they had all the scholarship was on their side. They did not bother to look over the English Channel. They really didn't bother. So he was a Brit and he was a Jew. And again, that was a strike against him. I mean, this is not for now, but when you look at Geiger's Urschrift, really a brilliant book, 1857, which again, I will deal with in the third talk. That too was a brilliant book, and very few German scholars took it seriously. Most were very dismissive. Being a Jew really was a strike against you in the development of biblical scholarship. What also happened here, and sometimes, we know that much of life is timing and good luck. Wellhausen published in 1878 his Geschichte Israels, and that changed the field. It pushed the field forward. And frankly, what he did, Wellhausen, for better or for worse, was work out a few things that Kalish clearly did not work out. Kalish's theories were somewhat still, theories in the making, ideas being developed, therefore somewhat incoherent. It's actually very hard to understand sort of, beyond, we understand the Leviticus Deuteronomy bit, but there's so much here that's so not clear. But there, there's an element of bad timing. I think Kalish essentially was simply forgotten, even in that count. And sort of, then, as the truck moved forward, just gets absolutely left behind. What I will say, and this maybe is just looking forward to me just pointing forward, I should say, to the third talk next week, is that, and I will try to make a point of this, there was good reason for Jews to be very upset with Wellhausen, given a very negative portrayal of Jewish history in general. But Kalish really had something else to offer. He had a far more positive view. I tried to sort of indicate this in some of the quotes, that I chose, where he says there's a grand spiritual journey that unfolds in the pages of the Hebrew Bible. But that, unfortunately or fortunately, I would say in the history of biblical criticism, was the road not taken, or at least not taken at this point. And with that, I will end.